I've learned about Bill in the brief time that I've known him. Bill is very generous and warm, and he obliged us by arriving in a day early to meet with Dr. Campbell's Intro to Museum Studies group. He had a lovely lunch with students today, and those students are interested in the museum world, history, and archaeology, so thank you for doing that, Bill. Bill has been friendly and helpful and kind, and we are very lucky to have him join us tonight. So on behalf of the Randolph community, I would like to welcome Bill Parkinson from Chicago.
Very nice. You should always introduce me. Hi everybody, welcome. Thank you for coming out tonight. I know there's other stuff going on that's important on campus. This is a real privilege. It's a real honor for me to do these AIA talks. The Archaeological Institute of America is it's a national organization. It's one of the largest lobbying groups for archaeology and cultural heritage in North America. One of the things that's cool about the AIAs is, unlike other professional organizations, it's not just professionals. And that's really important because it includes members of the general public. And that makes the whole flavor of the Institute very different than other professional organizations. Having folks who are members of the general public come to things like the conference, it changes the way that we talk about the work that we do, because we need to make the work accessible to folks, right, to the general public. And the fact of the matter is, in most universities, they pay lip service to that, but they don't actually value it. And so having an institute like the Institute of AIA, Archaeological Institute of America, is really important. They also make this awesome magazine called Archaeology Magazine, and so if you get Archaeology Magazine, you're kind of a de facto member of the AIAs. And people are welcome to come to the national meetings as part of it. One other thing for students I wanted to mention, if you Google AIA, AFOB, they publish the Archaeological Fieldwork Opportunities Bulletin every year, which is a great way to find out about what archaeological projects are going on if you want to participate on an excavation. These national lectures are awesome for me because I get to travel around and meet folks and learn about what's going on at different schools in different parts of the U.S. And this instance is absolutely no different. So I want to start by thanking everybody for inviting me and for your generosity and for being such wonderful hosts. Emily spent a lot of time with me over the last couple of days. Andrew, it was great to go to your class. And Kathleen, thank you so much for organizing everything. We should really give Kathleen a round. So what I would like to do today is, I've got a lot. This is action-packed. There's going to be a bunch of things going on. And I want to start by talking about the archaeology of inequality and why it's important, and why archaeology might not be an esoteric discipline that has little to do with the modern world. And then I'm going to talk about two projects that I've been involved with in Europe, in ancient Greece, and in the Great Hungarian Plain. And then I'll talk about this exhibition that we presented in North America, which ended just last year. Okay, so something weird happened in 2008. For the first time in the existence of humans on the planet, more than half of all of the humans living in the planet started to live in urban environments. That's insane. We didn't evolve to live on top of each other in big urban environments. We evolved as a species to be in small hunting and gathering groups that moved around. and that were pretty sparse on the landscape. So this is a big deal, this moment that we hit in 2008. Because what goes along with that urbanism in beautiful places like Chicago, my hometown, are other things. Like instances of inequality and degrees of economic, political, and social inequality that we've never experienced as a planet. And these things go hand in hand. As we were actually building this exhibition I'm going to talk about, this fact came out. In 2017, if you took all of the wealth owned by all of the humans, the 8 billion people in the world, if you took all of the wealth, you would give half of it to these 8 dudes. That's insane! This is just absolutely unprecedented levels of inequality that we've never experienced. And in a way, what I've been doing with my archaeological research is trying to figure out why. In sort of the big picture of the human existence, we evolved into those hunting and gathering groups somewhere between 70 and 40,000 years ago. And for tens of thousands of years, all humans lived in basically egalitarian hunting and gathering groups. Then in some parts of the world, we established farming villages. And when that happened, it took off like wildfire. Within a couple thousand years, the vast majority of people in the world went from hunting and gathering to producing their own food and living in full-time sedentary villages. After that, some of those got big and complicated. Some relatively quickly, some it took several thousand years for them to get big and complicated. At some point, this world that we live in, this globalized world, became this unequal urban world. But the story to understand how we got here doesn't start a couple hundred years ago with the Industrial Revolution. It starts thousands of years ago with really understanding how those farming villages were organized and how they changed over time. So I've had the privilege as an archaeologist to study this in these two distantly related parts of southeastern Europe, in southern Greece and in the Carpathian Basin. Most of my academic research has focused on this basic question. In the field of archaeology, we've done a really good job over the last 100 years at understanding how those hunting and gathering groups settled down into agricultural villages. We know where it happened, we know when it happened, we know kind of the conditions of what had happened, we know the repercussions of what happened after people started to live together as farmers. But there hadn't been, when I was a student, there hadn't been a lot of research dedicated to understanding, okay, so you have agricultural villages, what next? Why do some of them get big and complicated? In places like Mesoamerica, within a generation or two, once you have sedentary agricultural villages, things are big and complicated. You have elites, you have hereditary elites who are passing things down. These towns are growing really fast. In the Great Hungarian Plain, we have agricultural villages for several thousand years, and nothing that really looks truly urban until the Romans get there. So we see a dramatic difference in global perspective in terms of what happens after you have those agricultural villages. And I just put this up because these things go together, right? You seldom have, it's not without exception, but you seldom have the kind of elite hierarchy and inequality that you have in agricultural villages within hunting and gathering societies. There are some. There are examples out there. But they tend to be few and far between. And so in the history of anthropological archaeology, these have always gone together. How you see these small agricultural villages get big and complicated. Okay, now I'm going to give you two case studies that are very different. And the reason they're weird is because they're failed attempts at hierarchy. One of the things that we see in the archaeological record is success. We never see the first things. We don't get to see stuff until it sticks around long enough for us to actually be able to detect it in the archaeological record. And so the archaeology is itself biased towards success. We see the things that work. One of the things that when I'm talking about this to an anthropological group, I talk about false starts. In football, everybody lines up, they're all going to run a play, everybody's at the line of scrimmage, you're going to run a play, something goes wrong. You got to go back and reset and run the play again. And what we know archaeologically is that that happened over and over and over. And so what we see are these false starts towards things like urbanism. We see false starts towards things like hierarchy. And sometimes they work, and sometimes they don't. And so I'm going to give you two examples of these false starts. The first one is here. We're in southern Greece. We're down here on the Greek mainland. As I like to say, the mainland has three fingers, and the Mani Peninsula is the middle finger of Greece. And we're going to focus on this place right here called Archaeological Cave. This down here is as far south as you can be on the European continent and still be in Europe. And, this is not a bad place to work. I'm just saying, people ask me why I spend my summers there. It's not horrible. And this is the bay located on the western side of the Mani Peninsula. And the story here is about this cave, Aleppo-Tripa cave. Aleppo in Greek means fox. Tripa means hole, so it's foxhole cave. And the story of Aleppo-Tripa, this is a little bit of a grainy historic photograph, but this shows what it looked like when the cave was discovered. And it's the story of a boy and his dog, Kyriakos Koulakos, and his dog were out wandering around. The dog goes into the hole, the man crawls into the hole and finds this amazing, amazing cave. Okay, so this is an aerial photo from when the cave was formed. So you can see this is the bay over here. This is the mountain. We're going uphill, straight uphill here, and this is the extent of the cave into the side of the hill. The cave was discovered in the late 1950s, and immediately the Greek Ministry of Tourism said, hey, I know what we should do. Let's have a sound and light show. So they broke out the bulldozers, they broke out the dynamite, and they immediately started blasting back the entrance to the cave, putting in walkways and opening it up for the general public to be able to experience the inside of the cave with a fancy sound and light show. So this is what it looked when it was discovered. This is what it looks like now. So before, after. This is important because people don't live in caves. Caves are horrible places to live. They're damp, they're dirty, they're dangerous. You're not going to have kids rolling around on the floor in a cave. People live in front of caves. People live at the entrance to caves. People will use caves for a variety of different purposes, but they don't live in caves. We'll come back to why that's important as we tell the story. So the story of Aleppo-Tripa is one largely of death. One of the things that is hard for me, having worked inside this cave for several years, is explaining how big it is. Because the other thing about caves is that they're three-dimensional, right? They're not like you enter and you walk straight, right? In this cave, you kind of come into the new front that they've made after blasting it back, and you go into this room, which is, probably 7 times the size of this room. Then you go in, you drop down about 20, 25 feet, you come into some small niches, and then there's a little chokehold right here, which at the time was this big, had to crawl through it. And then you get into this chamber back here, which you could fit an entire football stadium in. right? And then at the very back of that chamber is a lake, and this is a brackish lake, and we're in southern Greece. Water is really important. Potable water is hugely important in this part of Greece. And this cave was used for burials. It was used for burials from the moment that you had agricultural populations living in Greece about 8,000 years ago until the end of the Neolithic period about 5,000 years ago. And for that 3,000 years, okay, this is something I've been wrestling with for 30 years, trying to wrap my brain around archaeological time frames. 3,000 years. That's time of Christ to now and half. Right? 3,000 years. Agricultural villages were using this cave primarily for burials. The real sad part of the story is that it was completely untouched until the 1950s. The cave was completely collapsed. There was nobody inside for 5,000 years until the Greek Ministry of Tourism decided to put in this light show. And we can tell that because this is an infant fragment. In this case, the infant wasn't buried. And so was found on the surface of the cave. And what you're looking at here is flowstone that drips off, it's calcium carbonate that drips off the ceiling of the cave and forms a thick crust. And that crust won't form if there's any activity in the cave. Anything will disrupt that. If it's not touched, it will form this thick layer of stalactite material, calcium carbonate. And there's many different ways that this place is being used for burials. In the back, that big, huge chamber, we've got largely scattered bones. Little chunks, mostly of limb bones, that are being ritually distributed throughout the back part of the cave. In an area right here, we've got an area that they're depositing human burials, but also smashing pots on top of the burials. And I can go into this later, we also can tell that they're burning sheep dung in this area. And they're not burning it, they're smoldering it. They're making smoke. They're actually creating smoke. And it's not like it's a sheepfold, because we're about 150 meters into the cave, and you have to drop down about 20 meters and crawl through a tiny little hole, so they're bringing sheep dung in. And they're not burning it, they're smoldering in this area to create an atmosphere of smoke. In the front, we've got several different ossuaries. And ossuaries they still occur throughout the Balkans. These are areas where you might have a burial that's deposited at one point, and then you might clean the burial, you might just bring chunks of the burial, and you put it all together. And so if you go behind many Greek churches in this part of Greece, you still see many ossuaries, where folks were buried maybe back at their village, and then a chunk of them is brought to this place and deposited here. And I'm going to focus on ossuary 2. And ossuary 2 is important, because ossuary 2 was used for 3,000 years and was a series of deposited skulls. So people were bringing skulls to this very specific part of the cave. We can tell that through radiocarbon dating. And we can tell not only that people are being brought to this specific niche inside the cave, like that corner is our corner, but we can tell that they're probably all from the same community. Because you all have metopic sutures in your head, and in all but about 3 or 4% of you, that suture is fully closed. In 4-5% of humans, that suture doesn't close. In this specific example, we see like 35% of the people don't have that suture closed, which means that they're probably from the same community. And so you've got individual communities that know that they need to use a certain part of this cave. For 3,000 years, they're passing this information down. 3,000 years to bury people in that specific spot. They're not local. We can tell through other kinds of isotopic studies, through human bone analysis, that they're not from there. They're coming from perhaps as far as the entire Eastern Mediterranean. They're being brought there to be deposited at this site. Sometimes it's like, you know, I can't bring all of Uncle Yanni's to the spot. I can bring Uncle Yanni's long bone and deposit it at the spot. I'll answer questions afterwards. And so we can't tell where exactly they're coming from, but it could be from all throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. So when I started working at this site in 2010, one of the things that we wanted to focus on was an area outside the cave, which we call Sakunaki Promontory, which was an area where we knew there had been a Neolithic site. Unlike the cave, which was used for 3,000 years, this was only used for about 500 years at the end of the Neolithic period. And so we cleared the area, we surface collected the area, we used geophysical, gee-whiz equipment that lets us see stuff under the ground. And we identified some areas that we could start to excavate. As we started to excavate these areas, we immediately found human bones and multiple skeletons. These date to the Neolithic period. We have multiple double burials at this site, which is interesting. This is a burial we affectionately call spooners because they are spooning. It's a male on the outside, male's big spoon, female's little spoon, and you can see their limbs are absolutely intertwined. They were clearly buried at the same time. And when the Greek Ministry of Culture issued the press release on Valentine's Day, there was all of these wonderful, loving. It's not a good thing if 2 adult people die, folks. That's not a good thing. That's not a good story. So we were excavating these individuals, and then adjacent to the spooners, we had another set of a paired individual couple. And unlike the spooners, these folks were one on top of another. A female with her hands behind her back, laying on her back, and a male on top of her. So we have the spooners. We affectionately called this the 50 Shades of Grey. And we couldn't excavate that burial because of this feature that's located on top of it. You see these stones right here? Right? So we're going to look at that from the top now. So now we're looking at this from the top. You see these stones. These are all. So this is a feature that was excavated in. And inside of all of these stones, we have all of these pebbles. These are stream-rolled pebbles. So these are being brought up from a stream that's about 200 meters away, a couple football fields away. They're bringing these stones up. They're lining this feature. And we have multiple layers of this stone lining. It's almost like a mosaic kind of lining, right? One on top of another. And in between that, there are more human bones than there is sediment. Everything that you see here, these are all human bones. Everything's a human bone. And these are fragmented, calcined human bones. And so we're excavating this, and we're like, oh my God, this is super cool. We have similar behaviors outside the cave to what we have inside the cave. We have individual burials, we have multiple burials, and now we've got an ossuary outside the cave, which is super cool. We're thinking it all dates to the Neolithic, and then my colleague says the only problem is these are late Bronze Age pieces of pottery. So this dates to the Mycenaean period. So we just added a 1,500-year chunk to to the end of the Neolithic period, when we see the reoccupation of this site, the reuse of this site for burials. And here's the thing, Mycenaeans don't do ossuaries. It's not what they do. This is something that's regional and very local to this part of Greece. They knew where the Neolithic burial site was. They knew what they were doing because they placed this literally directly on top of the Neolithic burials without disturbing them. This was really mind-blowing. It's a Mycenaean dagger. I never in my entire life thought that we would excavate a Mycenaean dagger. It's a bronze dagger that you see right there. And what's interesting is in the next trench that we put on the site, it's completely domestic. It looks like every other Neolithic village we've ever excavated. We've got animal bones, ceramics, spindle whorls for making thread. We have stone tools. We have celts, which are used like axes for chopping down trees. Right adjacent to where all of these burials are. Okay, how many? I'm okay. So the end of the story here, so what we can tell about what we know about Archaeology is that this is a site that was special. It was like a pilgrimage site for burials throughout the Neolithic. Folks are being brought there to be buried there. And after several thousand years, it then becomes an important economic center. And we see it flourish into this large, large center. So we have a ritual center that then becomes a large proto-urban center, but then something happens. It doesn't work. It's a false start. Possibly there's a big earthquake that collapses the front of the cave and shuts the whole thing down. But it doesn't turn into some of the big sites that we see on the Cycladic Islands, for example, at this moment in time. So we see the establishment of that big site, but of course, most of it's gone. So we're only seeing the fragment that was preserved because it wasn't turned into a road. Okay, that's first case study. Second case study. We're moving up to the Great Hungarian Plain, and we're moving to this corner of the Great Hungarian Plain. The region, the rivers here are called the Kurish region, and our project is affectionately called CRAFT, the Kurish Regional Archaeological Project. You can't take yourself too seriously if you're in this business. And this is like my hometown, right? So now we're in a completely different landscape, a completely different environment. Looks just like the Midwest. We've got big plowed fields that have been plowed for hundreds of years, thousands of years. So the nature of the archaeology is very different here. And what we did here was we actually adapted techniques that were largely used in the Mediterranean and started using them in this more temperate environment. And I was talking to some of the students today. Plows do a lot of work for you. Plows are wonderful from an archaeological perspective. They bring stuff up to the surface, and you can actually learn quite a bit just from looking at what is in the archaeology of the plow zone. And so here we have students on their hands and knees picking up 7,000-year pieces of pottery that we can date. And then we can go in with our fancier, now it's a little later, we've got fancier gee-whiz machines that we can strap to the back of an ATV and roll these things over these fields and actually scan the fields to learn about the archaeology of what's underneath the surface. What used to, literally previously 10 years ago, would take us 5 years to do, we can now do in a morning with one of these instruments. And so I'm going to focus on this late Neolithic site. So this is exactly the same time as Archaeology. Exactly as the same time that site is flourishing in southern Greece. We've got this site called Sekhalon Kovachevo. And so this is a LiDAR image. So this is a plane that scanned the ground. And what you can see here, this is lowland, right? This is higher, but it's Hungary, so it's literally like 2 feet higher than the lowland. But this is an old riverbed. That river got moved under the Habsburgs to make it a straighter canal over here. But this is an old riverbed. And then we've got a site located here. It was established a little over 7,000 years ago. And we use the word tell. Tell is an Arabic word for a site that grows up over time. Tel Aviv is a tell, right? As I tell my intro to archaeology students, people are dirty and predictable. And so because they're dirty, they bring a lot of stuff. They leave a lot of garbage. And so these sites physically grow up. And so what we see here in Hungary is the establishment of this tell site that's growing up. And then all around it are these other features that we can identify, both from the surface collections, because the plow's digging into them and bringing chunks of them up to the surface, but also using that gee-whiz ATV-driven geophysical piece of equipment. And what all of these are longhouses. These are massive, massive longhouses that are from me to the end of the room, from this pillar to this pillar to the end of the room, varying in size. And these are massive. They're built with huge oak posts in the place of these pillars that they're cutting with stone cells. And as we excavate these, so this is the great thing, right? We haven't dug yet. We know all of this from just from the surface. We haven't put a shovel in the ground, right? And so now, if we want to excavate, we can lay an excavation unit right on top of one of these longhouses. You're looking at half of it here. And what you're seeing here is burned wall rubble. If you have a mud wall, like an adobe wall, and you torch it, it turns into ceramic. And then if you take that ceramic and you push it down on top, you've got this burned wall rubble right on top of that house. And when you lift that up, in this case, as we excavate through that wall rubble, what we can see here is a plaster floor that's fallen onto planks. So it was a plank structure that was burned, and you can actually see the individual planks. These are the impressions of the burned out planks. So what's impressive about this site is that we have almost 200 of these longhouses at 7,000 BC. 200 of these longhouses. Now, by anthropological, analogy, if we look at groups like the Iroquois, Anishinaabe groups from northeastern United States, you're looking at several dozen people, at least, living in each one of those longhouses. So if you have several dozen people times 200, you have a ton of people living at this site. This is my colleague Attila. These are the post holes, and this is actually the footprint of the site of one of these longhouses after we've excavated through it. And what's amazing here is that they weren't occupied for very long. In some instances, it looks like they might have been occupied less than a generation. And so we can build another story for this site. The story of this site is we see the establishment of this tell, which then they actually modify the river to make the river go around it to create sort of a moat around the tell. And when they do that, then we see all of these groups that are moving in. And because we've got settlement, regional level settlement data, we can actually see these sites coming together. And so people that were living in these dispersed sites all throughout the landscape, they're all coming together at this site. But then it doesn't last. It doesn't last very long. They can't hold it together. And they eventually all move aside. The tell continues to be used for a cemetery. And then eventually it too is finally abandoned. So unlike the Greek instance, where we see all these folks coming together at that one special pilgrimage site, here, this is a regional level phenomenon. This is happening in all of the sites in the Carpathian Basin. We see this at site after site, same time, folks are doing this. I could get into, arguments about whether people are being pulled into these centers or whether they're being forced into these centers. I've got some ideas, but what's intriguing to me is the fact that we can see this at all of these unpronounceable Hungarian sites throughout the Carpathian Basin at that regional scale, which means that the processes that are pulling all of these together and pulling these people to live together in these instances is itself at least a regional scale. It's not a one-off like we see in Greece. And that has real important repercussions with regards to our understanding of things like urbanism and inequality. I'm currently involved in a project here where we're looking at exactly the same process in the Neolithic and comparing it to the same period, to the same area in the Bronze Age. Because what we have in Hungary in the Bronze Age is a lot more hierarchy. And it lasts a lot longer. So when we see the same pattern of nucleation at sites like this, where I've been digging the last 5 years, we see people coming together to live together. Now all of a sudden it lasts a lot longer. Many generations, like probably 10 to 15 generations. And so we're asking the question, why does it work here and why didn't it work in the Neolithic? I'm going to leave you hanging on. Okay, so I've been working with this guy, Attila. One of the great things about working in Hungary is you get to work with people named Attila. Since I finished my doctoral thesis there at the end of the Pleistocene. And Attila and I have been co-directing archaeological projects together. And we had just done a project on ancient Greece that we brought to North America for a tour in 2015. And Attila was in Chicago with me, and we said, you know what, we should do an exhibition on the ancient Balkans. Because nobody has ever seen the archaeology of the ancient Balkans. We're in Chicago, huge Balkan, East European population in Chicago. And Attila said, nobody, they would never do this in the Balkans. It would never happen. So we had the opportunity to do this. And when we develop an exhibition at the Field Museum, we always start with what we call the big idea. The big idea is the thing that you want people to know when they leave, right? And so it's got to be simple, it's got to be elegant, it's got to be impactful. And our big idea was, okay, you know what kings and queens are. We grow up in the Western world with queens in our fairy tales and our legends. They're baked into the religions that people in the Western world celebrate. We know what they are, but you know what? The world wasn't always like that. The world wasn't always made of haves and have-nots, of elites and commoners. And so in order to tell that story, we have to go back to the Neolithic. And so Attila and I saw this as an opportunity to tell the story of the work that we've been doing together for 30 years and make it accessible to the general public. So after we get our big idea, we come up with a bubble plan, which is a schematic. It's not really a physical division of space, but it's more of a theoretical division of how you want to tell that story. And here, because we're archaeologists, we want to tell it, of course, chronologically, because that makes sense to us. And so we start with the Neolithic and farmers, and we talk about the Copper Age, the Bronze Age, and we end up in the Iron Age with these earliest tribal kingdoms in Europe, folks that are in touch with the Etruscans and the ancient Greeks. And in the centerpiece of each one of those, we wanted an individual burial to help tell that story. And it's because burials are an important archaeological context. They're important because you don't bury yourself. No matter how much you wanna, you don't actually get to decide if you take it with you. And so a burial from an archaeological perspective is a very important kind of tool for learning about the past, because you're learning not what those folks thought of themselves, but what other people thought about them, how they viewed them. We knew this was going to be a challenge. In this part of the world, there's nobody my age, nobody in their mid-50s who hasn't been impacted by war. It's still very raw. While we were there were actually skirmishes on the Kosovo border with Serbia. This is still going on to this day. And so we knew that it was going to be challenging to pull this off. And I actually get Attila, he hates when I say this. He had the luxury of ignorance. He'd never done a big exhibition like this before. He had no idea how this would work. And so, I was like, we could actually do this with Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. It would be fine. We could tell the same story. And he was like, man, if we're going to do it, let's go big or go home. Let's be radically inclusive and make sure that these countries like Macedonia, which became North Macedonia during the project, like Albania, like Montenegro, these countries that are never asked to participate in things like this, let's make sure that we include them. And so I give Attila a lot of props for that. It was really his stick-to-itiveness that forced us to really involve everybody. And I had to make sure that the folks who run my museum knew what they were getting themselves into. Because this was a big ask for them, as much as it was a big ask for our colleagues in Eastern Europe. Because for this to work, we needed it to travel so that we could make some money back on our investment in the exhibition. We needed materials to be out of the country for almost 5 years. Almost every country involved has a 1-year limit on export, so we needed exceptions in every single instance. And I wanted this guy on the right, who's the head of our exhibitions department, to know what he was getting himself into. So we dragged him and my other colleagues from the museum to all of these places in southeastern Europe so that they could see what we were asking these people to do. Because we walked into the museum in Sarajevo the day before this. We walked into the museum in Sarajevo in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And the museum director said, I just want you to know, before we talk, I want you to know that my staff have been volunteering for the last 3 years because none of the 157 ministries in Bosnia will claim us. And so my staff haven't been paid for 3 years. And then as we were walking out of that museum, the museum director came out with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth, a paint scraper, and started scraping the gum off the steps of the museum. So I needed my colleagues at the field, in North America, the way it works is to say, oh, hi, I'm the director of this museum. I'd like to request that for my museum for another one. Okay, yes, director. It doesn't work like that in the Balkans. In the Balkans, you got to sit with these people, you have to drink coffee with them, you have to drink with them, you have to have meals, they have to trust you. And we knew that going into it. So by 2020, we had everybody signed up. It's February 2020, things are going, this is our mount man. She's there, she's measuring all of the objects. She traveled to all of the different institutions so that we had the mounts ready. And then that happens. And if you think that COVID was something for universities, I can't tell you what it was for museums. Because we can't just go online. That doesn't work. And we didn't know if we were going to open again. And not only did we not know, the folks that we were selling this project to didn't know if they were going to reopen. So nobody wanted to make any decision. And so Attila and I, at this point, had been working on the project for over 5 years. We had been going to all these places, laying the groundwork, and then we saw a little glimmer of light. Your tax dollars, thank you all so much. Your tax dollars came through and we got a $400,000 grant from the National Endowment for Humanities. And nobody wants to give back $400,000 to the federal government. So that let us leverage our administration and say, let's greenlight this project and make it work. So we ended up with 11 different collaborating countries. If you draw a line from the Greek border up to Slovenia, Hungary, and Romania, every one of them some that are not recognized by other countries, which made it challenging. We had 26 different institutions that gave us objects for this show, which we were really humbled by the things that people would give us and suggest that we take as part of this exhibition. And one of my proudest moments was when we had the opening reception at the Field Museum. And Kathleen, you'll appreciate it. So we've been working on this project for over 5 years. At this point, it was 8 years that we finally got it open. And the key to getting this kind of thing done is finding the right person in the museum to get things done. And in Eastern Europe, in all but one instance of all of those 26 institutions, that person was a woman of a certain age. And you found that woman of a certain age, you got the thing done. And she knew how to get the stuff done. She knew how to work the bureaucracy. She knew how to work her boss to get him to sign the forms. And then when we had the opening exhibition, you know what happened? All those people who worked with us for 8 years were pushed aside. And the director was going to show up. So Attila and I busted our tails because these were now our friends. These were folks that we had relied on. And in many instances, they actually put their careers on the line. And so we worked with the U.S. State Department, which at the time was absolutely fabulous to work with. We worked with local community organizations throughout the Midwest. You know, the Slovenian Club in Chicago. And we got every one of our colleagues there who wanted to come and actually could come. And we were very, very proud of that. It was a very emotional time for us to have this opening. We ended up with 3 venues in North America, which was part of the terms of the NEH grant, is that we needed other institutions involved. So the show started in New York, then came to the Field Museum, and then just a year ago, all the objects went back from the Canadian Museum of History. Attila and I went up for a last hurrah with all of our friends because, you know, when you have 26 institutions, they send couriers from all of those institutions with their own objects. And so the lift of putting this together logistically was really, really quite exceptional. In addition to your tax dollars, thank you again, we had funding from corporate funding from Discover Card and from the America for Bulgaria Foundation, which was very helpful in making this happen. So now, I'm almost done. I'm going to do a real quick run through just for those of you who hadn't seen it. Okay, there's our big idea. This is the first thing that you see. And so what we wanted to do with this was hit people with something that they recognized. And so this is actually the last commissioned crown for a European monarch. It was commissioned for Queen Maria of Romania at the beginning of the 20th century. And this, we asked for the original, they didn't give it to us. But this was the only replica in the entire show. Everything else in the exhibition was original. And we bookended the exhibition with the last crown, and we ended it with one of the earliest crowns from a Thracian king. This is basically the time of Philip II, Alexander the Great's father. And this is from Zlatonica. And then we've got our diachronic. This is how a bubble plan gets converted into physical space, which needs to be adapted. If it's going to many different places, you gotta be able to switch it up. And we started with this collection of figurines from Romania. This is a little collection of figurines. They're all individualized. There's clearly some mothers, clearly some children. And we use this as a way of talking about decision-making in these early villages and collective systems of decision-making where people are getting together and they're making these decisions collectively. This is actually a diorama of the site that Attila and I have been excavating for the last 20 years. Dioramas are awesome. Kids really love dioramas. And Attila and I are in there somewhere. This is now in the museum back in Hungary because one of the things that we wanted to do was make sure that any assets that we developed as part of this would then go back to those local museums so that they could use those assets there. This was one of the burial experiences. We had these oversized watercolors made by a local artist in Chicago to tell stories about the individual burials, as reconstructions of the individual burials. This is a woman who was buried on the Great Hungarian Plain about 7,000 years ago. And among other things, she's got all of these spondylus shells that are coming from the Aegean Sea. So 7,000 years ago, we have spondylus shells that are being turned into bracelets and that are being traded all the way up into the Carpathian Basin. These are some of the earliest copper axes in the world. This is a hoard, a very famous hoard of copper axes from Serbia that were paired with replicas of those objects, modern copper objects that aren't all green and nasty looking, but that are sharp and you know, kind of shine like bronze, which are now back at the museum in Serbia. We talked about the amazing Copper Age site of Varna, located in northeastern Bulgaria, right on the coast of the Black Sea, where you've got an unprecedented amount of gold at 6,500 years ago. One burial with more than 1,000 objects of gold, more gold than any other site at the time. So the fluorescence of the beginnings of hierarchy, that again, didn't last. This is a Bronze Age hoard from Hungary. This is common. You get these deposits where you get one sword and a bunch of hatchets that are buried together. This occurs regularly, so it's a ritualized kind of, it's not random. It's not like this one has a couple swords. You see one sword and a bunch of hatchets in specific locations that are buried perhaps to celebrate a truce or to recognize a victory. The term bury the hatchet actually comes from an old tradition of this ritualized actual burying of something that represents warfare. This is an assemblage. This is a gold hoard from Sarasaur Saraso in Hungary and Romania. And this is a great story. So this hoard was discovered during the Habsburg Empire. And when the modern nation states of Hungary and Romania were formed, one half of the hoard went to Budapest. The other half of the hoard went to Bucharest. And it was never put on display together until this exhibition. And so we really saw this as sort of symbolic of what we were trying to do with this exhibition. As we get into the Iron Age, we see amazing. So this is this big, right? Anybody want to guess what those beads are made of? Any guess? Shells, good guess. Ooh, amber. You know where amber comes from? The Baltics. So these are all, and some of these amber beads are this big, that are being traded into these elite burials in Croatia across thousands of kilometers. When we got to Bosnia, when Attila and I were talking to our colleagues about this, we got to the museum in Sarajevo. We said, you know, here's our idea for the exhibition. What objects do you think would be appropriate? And our colleague Adriana in Bosnia said, you have to take our girl. Our princess deserves a tour. If you're going to do this show, you have to take her. She should go to North America. If you're going to talk about hierarchy, there's no better way to talk about hierarchy than this elite 12-year-old girl, this elite 12-year-old burial from an elite river valley and from an elite tumulus of burials on the Bosnian plateau. You know, and you can see she's absolutely decked out. This is the Iron Age, right? So at this point, bronze is a very elite material. And she's got these massive earrings, she's got this massive necklace, these massive bracelets. This is a bronze sash. These are spindle whorls. She's got a vessel that would have been buried with something important in it. And the stories just go on like this, right? One after another. One of the things that we can see during the Iron Age, and remember, we're not cheating with writing here. When we're in the Balkans, it's not like you're in Greece where you've got written sources. I call that cheating. Right? Here, we don't have written sources. Folks around them are writing stuff down. But we don't actually have any written sources. Right? We have a couple names here and there. But we can see things through the archaeology. This bronze crater is from a burial in Hungary. It's almost certainly made in a Spartan workshop. The southern tip of the Greek mainland. We're seeing the movement of these objects all the way throughout the European continent. And this is the time period where we have mercenaries being sent, mercenary armies being sent back and forth. We see connections with Persia, with ancient Greece. We see elements of Persian art, Achaemenid art in all of this. Because part of the scam of selling hierarchy is that all the elites are in on it. They all buy into the same game. Hey, you got a crown. You must be a king. I got a crown. I'm a king. You support me? I'm in a little trouble. Can you send me an army? Yeah, I'll send you my army. This is how it actually works. And in this instance, we know from earlier Greek instances that they're not just sending armies, they're sending word. Hey, you want a fresco painter? I got a fresco painter. I'll send my guy. He'll come over. I'll send an entire workshop of people to create perfumes for you. They're all supporting one another. And this is really how you end up with this hierarchy and these incredible inequalities that we have in modern society. So this is a burial assemblage from Zlatonica. That crown that I showed you before, that we ended with, this is actually a leg plate. So this would have been, and people would say, like, why would you decorate your legs like that? Because if you're on top of a horse, these are at eye level. You're making a statement. This is literally what people are looking at when you ride into town. And we ended with the crown from that, and this amazing collar, which is actually from another site that they paired really well in the case. This is actually iron and gold on top of it. It's really heavy. And I wish I would have included in that case this little ring. Because this little ring shows the goddess handing the crown to the king. Because the way that you seal the deal in all of these ancient kingdoms is it's because the gods wanted it that way. Why do I have all this stuff and all this wealth and you're a serf? Gods wanted it that way. And that continues in Europe up through the medieval period and more recently in other parts of the world. We ended up with 3 books as a result of the exhibition. There's an edited volume that we actually wrote with our colleagues from the area that's written for the general public. This is the catalog, and we actually have a couple editions of these because there was a French edition of the souvenir book. And just to give you a sense, these are just the contributors for the books, right? And so these are just folks who actually wrote text for the books. But the actual numbers of contributors, the people who did this work in these museums for over 5 years for us, are literally number in the hundreds. And we, Attila and I, will eternally be grateful to them for the work that they did for us. When I do exhibitions, and actually when I do archaeology, I'm reminded of this quote. So I actually got this. This was a piece of fan mail. You never get fan mail when you do an exhibition. You always get critiques like, why didn't you do that? Or, like, if I would have done this exhibition, I would have had that. Or, why is this map like that? In this instance, this is from another exhibition I had done before, but it was always in the back of my mind. A gentleman from Chicago suburbs said, you know, when I went through this exhibition, it reminded me of this quote by Chesterton. I didn't know who Chesterton was. sort of a theologian, philosopher, but he's got this great quote where he talks about having the luxury to be able to kind of look back from a mountaintop to see how you got where you are. And this was in the back of my mind as we were developing this exhibition the whole time. And it's really come to influence why we study the past. We have the luxury to be able to really look at how we got where we are. And if we're just studying the past for some esoteric reason, we're not doing it right. We have to make things relevant to the general public, and we have to make people see that we can understand how we got to this place. We might not always like it, but understanding things like urbanism and hierarchy are critical to that. And this is a story that didn't start a couple hundred years ago. This is a story that started several thousand years ago. So I'll leave it there. Thank you all. I'm happy to answer questions. No questions? Good. All right.
What is the largest difference between early monarchies and current monarchies, in your opinion?
That's a great question. Scale. The big issue in early monarchies, and especially these kinds of tribal kingdoms that we're talking about in the Balkans, which we can learn a lot about from their counterparts in ancient Greece, and classical Greece, and Hellenistic Greece, is that they were super fragile. They were super fragile. They were always in competition, which is why, like, Alexander's exceptional, right? Because he held it together, not for very long, but he held it together and actually expanded in a way that was truly exceptional at the time. You know, before that, there were other kinds of confederacies and things that were basically loose alliances where folks who were normally beating up on one another would come together and go like, hey, we gotta team up on this. Okay, these Persian dudes are coming, we gotta do a thing, right? And so they tended to be very, very temporary and very spread. And also they would cycle. You'd see many different forms of hierarchy. Everybody points to Athens. The democratic system of Athens within the world of Greek city-states was exceptional. You had everything from monarchies that were passed down to oligarchies. So they were much more variable. And in Europe, after the Roman Empire, we saw the crystallization of monarchies in a way that then became imperial and that had technological and other kinds of resources that these folks just couldn't muster back in the day. So I think that's the biggest difference. There are other folks who can help answer that.
Did you have a favorite object in the general, like First Kings exhibition? Did you have a favorite object?
That's interesting. I don't know. The stuff from Barn is super cool. Like it's so exceptional. This is a cemetery that's established in Necropolis. It's also the very first time that you get cemeteries in Europe. Cemeteries aren't a thing until the Copper Age. And then, and if you think about it, if you're burying Uncle Bob behind the house, part of a cemetery is a performance, right? Part of a burial ritual is showing off, right? I can put all this stuff in the ground. Well, if you're burying Uncle Bob behind a barn, the audience that's coming to that is like your neighbors. They already know you're kind of a jerk, right? So they're like, yeah, there we go again, right? But when this phase in Europe, when you start to get cemeteries that are pooling from different communities, it becomes a regional scale performance. And so now, I'm not just performing in front of my neighbor Ed, who's probably my cousin anyway, right? Now I'm performing in front of the region. And so as a performance, the burial becomes this very important center, which from the beginning of the Copper Age until now remains a very critical part of how the elite demonstrate their wealth. And by demonstrating their wealth, they demonstrate their right to that wealth because they have it and you don't.
About the cave in Greece that you first talked about, is there any chance that it tied the rituals there tied into Greek like mythological ideas, or was it really too early for that sort of paradigm to form?
That's really interesting. So we can trace classical Greek myths into the Bronze Age. We can get there through a variety of different sources, including folks like Homer, right? Who are clearly writing about the Bronze Age. We can see they've got some of the same gods, some of the same rituals. He's probably imposing his own world on the past quite a bit, but you know, there's some things going on that we can actually see. What's interesting about Archaeology is that just south of there, the project that I'm doing right now, which I didn't talk about, there's a site called Tyneron, right at the southern tip of the middle finger, right at the very southern tip. And Tyneron is one of the classical entrances to the underworld. And so it was, you know, well, there are a few, Eleusis outside of Athens is another one. There are a few places like this that were entrances into the realm of Hades, right? And when we started working at Archaeology, my colleague Yorgos Papathanassopoulos, who had been excavating there for decades, Yorgos had this theory, right, that Alapotripa was actually the original entrance to the underworld. And then, you know, he's a very classically trained Greek scholar, like very old school. Alapotripa was the original entrance to the underworld, and then the entrance collapsed at the Bronze Age, and then the story was passed down for thousands of years and re-emerged at Tyneron. And we were like, okay, Yorgos, that's a nice story, but you're talking about 3,000 years, right? When we found the Mycenaean ossuary on top of the Bronze Age, on top of the Neolithic burials, that time period was just cut in half. And so we started saying, well, maybe Yorgos is onto something there. There's, you know, what has continuously impressed me about that project is the power of oral history and the power of communities to pass things down and encode them in songs and rituals and myths and legends over thousands of years. It's the only way we can explain this repeat, literally for thousands of years, the only way we can explain that repeated behavior is through those kinds of rituals being encoded in legends. So we don't know what the legends were, but we can tell that they have. Yeah?
Other than humans, what is the biggest challenge of artifact recovery?
Of artifact, other than humans. Of artifact recovery?
Of recovering all of these pieces. What is the biggest challenge that might prohibit that?
One of the biggest challenges is now storage. It's a huge issue. In the project that I'm currently working in with Greece, one of the biggest points of negotiation that we've had is where to put the stuff after it's excavated. And in fact, now the rule in Greece is everybody has to pay for their own storage area. And you have to link it to the state security system, and you have to pay for it during the duration of the project, and then you have to arrange for permanent curation. And so one of the things is like the opposite of your question. One of the things that's happening now is folks are figuring out how to collect less, how to actually collect less stuff. Because, you know, I'm working in early periods. The folks that, you know, you've got folks in the audience here who work in later periods, and you want to talk about stuff. You look at a Roman town in North Africa, and you want to see some stuff. We've got a lot of stuff, right? That's nothing compared to what my folks are generating in the Neolithic and the Bronze Age. Is nothing on the scale of that. And so it's a huge issue. And in many parts of the world, not only there, but also in North America, folks are trying to figure out how to really minimize the amount of collection that you're doing. It's a great question. Yeah?
So like you can't really help what you discover and what you don't. So what do you do with the stuff if you decide you don't want to keep?
That's not a good choice. Yeah. No, you're obligated from an archaeological standpoint to report it and to document it. The question about keeping it is different. I mean, like I had a colleague who worked on Neolithic sites in Northern Europe, and he worked in Belgium. And where you get these huge Neolithic sites like the one that I showed you in Hungary, exactly the same kind of site. And his Belgian colleagues would use a bulldozer to remove the Roman overburden on top of the site, right? So it was, to be fair, it was mostly cloud context anyways, but they would come in literally with a bulldozer and just remove it. And so part of that is context dependent, right? And it really depends on the period, like how much Roman architecture you want to save, right, is a huge question. Because, you could fill a room in a week with the amount of architecture you could excavate. And so it kind of depends where you're working, what the tradition is there, but you're sort of ethically obligated to report on everything that you find. Whether you end up keeping it all or not is really dependent upon local practice. Yeah?
Is there any guesses as to why there's smoking sheep dung in there? Are they making an atmosphere to?
That's what I think.
Okay.
Yeah, because we couldn't believe this. Like when we first, it was, because I was excavating it, and we were excavating through it, and it's this greasy black sediment, and it's a real cool time to be an archaeologist because there are all these new technological developments that didn't exist when I was an undergraduate, right? And so, including the geophysical stuff. But one of those developments is a technique called micromorphology. And so, micromorphology means as an archaeologist, I can look at strata and I can see oh, that's a floor, and then there's a platform underneath, there's another floor. I can see they're building multiple floors, right? In micromorphology, you go in and you take a sediment sample as a block, you impregnate it with epoxy, and you grind it down so that you can look at it like a slide under a microscope. And so where I can look at a sediment block, and I can say, well, that's a floor. I have a colleague who can go in and say, actually, that's created by the repeated behavior of multiple mats being laid down over time on top of clay that's being reproduced over and over. And so in this instance, what the heck is this black stuff, right? And he went in, and it's absolutely sheep dung that is not burned but smoldered, which means they're making smoke. And again, that's another one of these contexts where we have burials, but we can also see they're taking in decorated pots and they're smashing the pots as part of it. And that area is right at the top of the huge chamber. So when you enter that huge, and it's very cool, I love showing people through this because you go in and you're in, I've seen a cave, I've been to Grand Canyon, whatever, I've seen a cave, I've been in here, and then you get to the top of that room, and you walk, and you're standing at the top of this room that you could literally fit a stadium inside. And everybody catches their breath. Every single time I walk somebody through, I wait for it, and I get the, because it's just so awesome, literally awesome. And so what I think is going on is they're creating smoke to fill that chamber, and then there are rituals going on. The other thing about Archaeology that I didn't talk about is the water. Because in southern Greece, where we work at Tyneron, on the southern tip, if you don't have a cistern, you're dead. You need cisterns to save water all year. And to have a place where you've got potable water that was potable at the beginning of the excavations in the 1950s and 60s is absolutely huge. And when you've got big karstic environments, it's active. I mean, if you stand there, you get dripped on, right? And so in the front of the cave, they have these huge stone-lined pits, clay-lined pits, where they're collecting water as part of it. And so there's something going on with water and, underworld, I don't know. But I think that the burn dung is for creating smoke as part of a ritual to create that environment.
So
Yeah.
is there a center to the cave? I mean, is there a focus point, or is it just, so there's no particular focus point?
No. And again, because it's used for 3,000 years, and because it's severely messed up when they put in all of the walkways and stuff. Because I was trying to do too much today, I removed some of the photos, but in the areas that haven't been destroyed, it's just lined with ceramics. Like you can just see the whole floor is lined with ceramics and flowstone on top of it in the few areas that haven't been destroyed. And so it's a pretty complex puzzle to unpack. And so what we end up with are kind of like, okay, we know what's going on in this corner, kind of know what's going on in that corner, we've got this preserved context. And so it's hard to say. There might have been something in the back that was like a focal something, but there's nothing like an altar or anything like that that we can identify, or a Stonehenge kind of feature, built feature that would have been an epicenter.
So you talked about earlier with that ring that depicted the goddess giving the king his crown. Did Bulgaria in like that Balkan area have its like own system on like pantheon and mythology of gods and goddesses, or was it like is it something we remember today that that's like recorded?
No, but they were all of these folks. So part of I wasn't joking about like the game of the hoax. The game of the hoax is all of these folks believing similar things and exchanging those ideas and those craftspeople. And so what we can see in Bulgaria is they're adopting the Greek pantheon. Absolutely, certainly by later periods of time. The same way you see the same pantheon adopted in Etruscan culture. But in Etruscan culture, then it's not just Greek, it's also Egyptian. Oh, and then the Greeks are pulling it from Egypt. And so they're all ultimately buying into the same sort of worldview, which ultimately lends itself to, oh yeah, Zeus, that dude, he's a king, right? Oh, look at that. The gods are doing it, why don't we? Right? And so this is a feature that you see, and honestly, this is exactly what happens with Christianity later in European monarchies in the medieval period. The story of the Holy Grail is trying to link Arthur to Christ. Like that's literally what it is trying to make that link, right? And this happens over and over and over. And so it's not something that happened once in the ancient world. It's a tradition that worked, and folks kept doing it. Other questions? Oh, there we go.
Yeah, so I really like what you brought about the idea of forced relocation to create some of these urban centers. And so at the site in Hungary that you're working at, what sort of evidence were you maybe seeing that led you to think that may happen, or maybe brings up the question?
Right. So I didn't say forced. Intentional relocation is going on. And this plays into this is the $20,000 question, right? Because so there's a guy at Arizona State who was studying modern urbanism and ancient urbanism. And he was invited to this conference on modern urbanism. And he's an archaeologist who works in Mesoamerica. And in modern studies of urbanism, there's always this discussion about whether people are pushed into these environments or whether they're pulled into these environments. And in studies of modern urban societies, right, like a town of 10 million people has 10 times as many roads, sewer pipes, infrastructure kind of things as a town of 1 million people, right? But a town of 10 million people has way more than 10 times as many cafes, clubs, playhouses, bars, restaurants. Things that are social in modern urban environments scale not arithmetically, but exponentially. Because there's stuff going on in cities, right? People are drawn to cities. There's way more economic opportunity. There's way more stuff going on. So this guy, Mike Smith, was invited to this conference, and he's like, oh, wow. Actually, when I look at this comparatively, it actually works in ancient cities, too. Is that people are drawn to these places. And so the reasons that they're drawn to those places can vary. In many places in Asia, for example, people are drawn to pilgrimage places because they're big, important economic centers because of pilgrimage that's carried out there. Not unlike on a poetry club. In other instances, this is kind of a regional level phenomenon. In Central Europe, for example, German sociologists have demonstrated that, you get this hierarchy of primary centers, secondary centers, tertiary centers, because they're efficient ways of distributing goods, especially when you have things like trains, right? And so places become important nodes because they're in places of transportation or exchange. That's what I think we have going on in Hungary. Many of the models, and it's really interesting, if you look at the evolution of ideas, the early evolutionary ideas of why you get cities is, well, people had to move there because they were scared, and there's power in numbers, and it was ideas like that. But just as frequently, ethnographically and historically, when people are under siege, they literally run for the hills, right? You see dispersal just as frequently as you see nucleation or settlement aggregation. And so more and more models are leaning towards pull models that are attracting people to these places because they become important for a specific reason. And then my question is, why do some of those establish hierarchy, and how does hierarchy play out in those instances? Because in our Hungarian example, one of the big differences between the Neolithic and the Bronze Age is hierarchy. We've got a lot more strong leaders and hereditary elites that are born into these positions in the Bronze Age than we do, and that's when it tends to last longer. Yeah?
Last question.
Oh, okay. Did you have different titles for the exhibition in different venues?
Yes, we did.
Wow.
We had
Why
different.
was that?
Oh, titles are one of my favorite things to talk about. Let me tell you. Okay, what's the problem with an exhibition called First Kings of Europe?
Well, you left out the women.
Where are the women? Right? Exactly. Sounds kind of like a 1% show, right? It's all about dudes. It's all about kings. It's all about exhibition titles are something that we argue about all the time. We've argued over and over about this exhibition. In North America, we talked about Balkans. Nobody knows where the Balkans are. Can't use that. People get the Baltic and the Balkans confused all the time. We're a natural history museum. There was a push for monarchs. First monarchs. What's the problem if you're a natural history museum? Butterfly. Right? We landed eventually on first royals, slightly less sexist. And when we sent the book in for review to UCLA for review, the reviewers said, First Royals is a title. I'm expecting this to be a reality TV show about the British Royals. And the show was going to Canada.
Right.
So we ended up with First Kings of Europe because the game is something that is descriptive, that will get, and remember, I've got to sell this to Jimmy, the 4-year-old boy, and, you know, Annie M. And I got to get them all to want to come. And then this is the challenge for museums. Our challenge in museums is, you know, we've got to get people to make the decision to come to our show, to pay money to go to our museum, not go next door where they cheat because they have live animals at the aquarium. Talk about cheating. Penguins are cute, y'all. We got to get them to come to our place. We have to make them interested and curious about it, and then we have to teach them something, you know. And so what we chose to do as part of the title for our exhibition was spin it in terms of kings, right? You'll notice all of the burials are females. Everybody in all of the individual burials are about women. And the content of the show was about women. And I thought we were going to get into it. We talked about LGBTQ plus in the past. And in a Bulgarian section, I thought that was going to get us in some serious heat with, you know, the Bulgarian plumber, right? But that's the trick. The trick is to get people in the door. Titles are designed to get people in the door, and then you got to teach them something. This show was about the evolution of inequality. But you know what nobody wants to do on a Saturday afternoon is go ponder the inequities of the world. So you got to get them in the door, and then hit them with the fact that, sorry, the world's really unequal, and this is how we got it. Right? In New York, at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World, which was part of NYU, they had a smaller version on display, and they, from the very beginning, were like, we can't have all, you know, ours was a 7,000 square foot, 7,500 square foot exhibition. They're like, we've got 2 rooms, so we need to change it. We have to focus it. Great. And then in Canada, they've got to do things in both French and English. And so they changed it to First Royals because it translates better for them. And they are part of the crown, and so it's less ridiculous for them. But that's a great question. And honestly, you would not believe. We had a museum president who at one point actually wanted it to be First Royals, blood and gold. And we were like, man, like this is like a war-torn part of the world. You really don't want to talk about blood. Like it's bad enough. But it's always something interactive and iterative with our, you know, because PR wants to weigh in, and you know, and so we go back and forth.
You just touched about this, but did the story of the exhibitions and like what was displayed change based on the venue, the 3 venues that the show went through?
Yeah, because the earliest venue was very small, so they only had a quarter of the objects. And then the Canadians got to cheat because they saw our show and then were able to build on it. And they actually had bigger space. And so they actually took what we did and improved on it, I think, in many ways. Because, you know, it's like why you should never hand in the first draft of the paper to your professor, right? You should always go through a couple of drafts before you hand that thing in, because it's going to get better each time.